Today is January 12th, 2023. I am Gabriele Fellows with the Museums of Lake County, and this is an oral history interview with Darlene Hecomovich. Darlene, thank you for being here today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So to get started, what can you tell us about your name? Were you named after anyone?
Well, my first name, Darlene, my family had Seiglers at the time I was born, and the milkman's wife just had a daughter that they named Darlene, and they were charmed with that name, so they gave it to me. The last name, Hecomovich, is the name of my husband, and it's a Yugoslavian name, and he grew up in Minnesota, where there was a collection of Yugoslavians that lived there.
I see. What is your date of birth and how old are you?
My date of birth is January 31st, 1935, and I am 87 years old, soon to be 88.
And where were you born?
I was born in San Francisco. My family had lived at Seigler Springs at the time, but we went to San Francisco for all our medical needs at that time. And I think the doctor facilities and hospitals were pretty minimal in Lake County, and they had family there, so that's where I was born, San Francisco.
And what were your parents' names?
My mother's name was Dorothy Blues Olson, and my father's name was Ernest Olson, but he was always known as Ernie.
And did you have any siblings?
I had two sisters, an older sister, Claire, and a younger sister, Paula.
And where were you raised?
We were raised at Seigler Springs in Lake County. Mm-hmm.
And where's that located?
That is located on Seigler Canyon Road, which is sort of a connecting road today it's connecting road between Highway 75 and Highway 29. And then Highway 29 goes into Lower Lake there. So we're about 5 miles from Lower Lake in the mountains above the lake.
And who would you say raised you?
My parents, during the summer when they were busy, when we were young, we always had a housekeeper but that kept tabs on us, but we were really free to run all over the resort, but we just had somebody that was more or less in charge, but she didn't follow us around at all.
Mm-hmm. And what does your father do for a living?
My father had worked for Ford Motor Company in San Francisco, and at the time that he had the opportunity that was what he was doing when he had at the time he had the opportunity to purchase Seigler Springs. So then from then on, he worked both my mom and dad managed the resort.
Oh, okay. What were your mom's duties, her job duties?
Everything. Both my mom and dad, they either did everything or we had a big staff but they were in charge of it. My father was more in charge of the outside, the maintenance, any type of building or construction or repair, and yard supervision, where my mother was more in charge of the office and the dining room, but we had a store and a bar and all kinds of, bathhouse, all kinds of facilities, and they just oversaw it, but they had staff that did all the hands-on work.
Mm-hmm. And what do you know about how your parents met?
I actually, when you asked me that, very little, but they were both very social people in San Francisco at the time, and I just think they met as all young people do at young people's events, and they were both very beautiful dancers. They did a lot of dancing, and so they were out and about a lot and just met.
And when did they get married?
They got married in 1931.
And what are some of your earliest childhood memories?
I guess most of my childhood, probably the strong childhood memories, are those that I had at Seigler Springs in the summertime, more than in the winter. Preschool at home in the winter, I know I was always sort of at a loss for something to do. I think I drove my mother nuts because I always said, well, now what can I do? To the point that she sent me to school a year early because and you could do that at that time. Now you have to wait to the proper age, but she just wanted to get me out of her hair, I think. Mm-hmm. And I can just remember the joy of the resort as a little child. there would be a lot of the guests that would come up. They would be families with children. That was fun, and there was always all the activities that the guests could do at the resort, as far as swimming or playing ping pong or whatever. And the other thing we did, my parents were very good employees, very considerate, and they often had parents, like my mom, I know they had a single mother that also had a child. And they allowed the child to come up and stay at the resort as well. So there were always a couple of children of the workers that were around there and that were fun to play with. But it was just a resort that was full of things to do, and we did them. And it was a contrast to in the wintertime, because we had no neighbors there in the winter. There it was isolated, and I had my two sisters to play with, and they often weren't that interested in playing with me. And I were in the resort. It was just a busy time.
And did you have a best friend as a kid?
I had best friends in school, yes, yeah. And then I also had best friends that were guests that would come up. There was one family, the Bell family, and her name, the daughter's name was Mary Bell. And so I always was looking. I could go into the office, and there was where they would have the reservations posted with the name on, and I could look and see who was coming up where. And then also, I know there was another family I really liked that had two dogs that I particularly cared for. So I was always eager for them to come up, because then I had those little dogs. I'd go over to their porch and play with them. And,
did you have a pet growing up?
We always had dogs,
Oh, okay.
one or more, usually just one. But yeah, we always had a dog, yeah.
And did you have any hobbies as a child?
I can remember one of the particular things I liked to do when we had paper dolls, which I don't think they have so much anymore. And the great fun of the paper dolls for me was cutting them out. I liked the idea of cutting them out, and then you had the dresses that you could clip onto the dolls and that kind of thing. Where my older sister, whom I played with, she was more interested in playing with the dolls after you had them cut out, where I would just as soon be cutting out some more dolls. But yeah, with paper dolls. And I wasn't much for real dolls, but I did like the paper dolls. And I remember liking to play games, like Rover, Red Rover, Won't You Come Over, where you have teams, and you throw a ball over the roof, and then whoever catches it, and they would run back on the other side and try to tag you. But that was something I think I played more at school than at home.
Did you have a favorite subject in school?
My favorite subject in school would have been reading.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I really liked reading and stories and literature, and that was a lifelong interest of mine.
Do you remember what your favorite book was back then?
Let me see. I liked the Nancy Drew series of books, and then when I was littler, there was the Bobbsey Twins series of books, and I can remember reading those. But I liked as I got older, The Secret Garden, and Daddy Longlegs. That was a book that I can remember enjoying. And what the problem there was, though, there was I think there was a small library in Lakeport, but we didn't use it. A book was a big purchase. They didn't have paperbacks at that time. And if you're an avid reader, you'd get a book, and then, in a few days, I would have read it, and I wanted another one. And it wasn't that there were a lot of books available, so I did a lot of rereading. And I know when I would visit one of my cousins that lived in San Francisco on Cortlandt Avenue, there was a nice library that we would go to, and I was so envious of that library to have the books there. And they would take books out for me, while I was there, and I could read them, but they never wanted me to take them home, of course, because who knows when they'd get back to the library. Yeah.
And did you have a favorite teacher?
Well, the schools at that time, at Lower Lake School, there were two teachers and two classrooms. There was the first classroom was from 1 to 4, and the second classroom was 5 to 8, and that was up until I think I probably got into the 7th grade, and then they had like a junior high, a 7th to 8th classrooms, and the others were broken down smaller. And for my first grade classroom, it was a Mrs. Berg, and I think she truly was a wonderful teacher. I really liked her. And I look back now and am amazed at how she could have 4 classes in that one classroom and have us all quiet and be doing things and not having just a complete circus going on. And she would take a group back there was a table at the back of the room, and she'd take one class back there and be working maybe with reading or something with that class, and the rest of us had other things to do, and we did them. And the other nice thing about that is while you're sitting there and you're in grade 1, you also hear what's going on in grade 2. And so you have the opportunity to learn not just your class, if you can listen to what's going on in 4th grade. And if you're interested, you pick up all that information. So end result was that I skipped 2nd grade. So and I think while I was in 1st grade, I was learning 2nd grade material, and it was fun. I always liked school. And then getting into the 5th grade, then that was Mr. Rose, and he was a taxidermist that lived in Lower Lake, and he did taxidermy, and and would have, if you went to his house, he would always have like deer or animals always stuffed. And I don't know what I was doing at his house, but we would visit him for some reason or other. And I think they were both really dedicated, very fine teachers. I think we were lucky to have such good teachers.
And how many school buses were there?
Well, at the time when I was in grammar school and probably into high school, there were 2 school buses, and they were the bus drivers were Mr. and Mrs. Vernon from Lower Lake, and they were a prominent Lower Lake family, and they owned it was the Big Oak Cafe, I think, and that was a bar and a restaurant, and they had a lovely home that was up on the hill on the south side of. Probably wasn't much of at the time as a child it looked like a hill, but I think it's probably just a little rise, and they had a lovely home there. And that is one of the things that as we think what today's world is like as compared to what it was back like then. And to me, one of the good examples of trying to explain to just the difference is that we had, for the same district, then it was the Lower Lake School District, but now the Connaughton School District encompasses that same area. And when we were the Lower Lake School District grade, I know through 8th grade and into 1st grades of high school, we had 2 school buses that did the whole route. Like our school bus would come up from Lower Lake, it would go up Seigler Canyon, then it would go all the way out Point Lake View and pick up those children, and then bound into Lower Lake. And then the other bus went out towards East Lake and picked up all the students. And at that time, too, there was elementary school in Lower Lake, and there was an elementary school at Burns Valley, as well as one in Clear Lake Oaks at East Lake. But there was only one high school, and that was the Lower Lake High School. But the district was just the same. So we had the 2 buses that made all those runs, picked up all those students. And now when I go by the bus yard, they're on the old Highway 53 or wherever it is out of town, there's 20, maybe 30 buses. And you think 2 buses to 30 buses? It's just incredible to think of the size of the number of students now that are serviced by those buses and by the schools. I think that we had, I know although my years in high school, there was approximately 100, between like 95 and 100 students in the whole school. Each class had about 25 students. So it was very small.
And did you have a mentor growing up?
I think always sort of the mentor that I kind of leaned to would be the English teachers, because that was my favorite subject. And then more so than the other teachers, I might favor them or hang around them, and often the teachers, the high school teachers, were first-year teachers right out of college with their first job, kind of a thing, and they never stayed long. They'd stay a couple of years and then probably moved on to a bigger community. But they were always fresh and lively, and they were fun. I think in general I enjoyed our teachers.
And were you involved in any after-school activities?
Uh, as far, not in grammar school, I don't think there were really that much in the way of after-school activities. We would have a play or maybe a musical performance kind of a thing, but as far as any sort of a regular activity, there wasn't. And then in high school, particularly the boys would have sports as their outside, they'd stay after school for their sporting events, or I think the girls, they always had PE. And we didn't, it wasn't anything that was that elaborate that we stayed after school. Even though we had competition games, I don't know necessarily other than the games that we played outside, but I don't think we stayed after school.
Oh,
that
okay.
the basketball was just part of the school system, and that would be partly because you had to get all these students home, and you had the little kid, for as far as running buses
Yeah.
for all over the place to bring kids that were staying for after school activities. But I don't. And there really wasn't much in the way like of Girl Scouts or that type of thing.
Oh.
Yeah, I can't really recall any type of. I think most of it was just in school stuff, and we had PE and recesses where we would play outside.
Mm-hmm. So how was the county different back then?
Oh, the county was very different. It was, first of all, population, size-wise. When you consider Lake County, and say the south end is south of Middletown on Highway 29 as it goes up the Mount St. Helena, that's the county line there. And if you at the other end, you go all the way to Blue Lakes. And the population in the 1940s, I think, was around 8,000 in the whole county. And today's now, if you take the population of Lakeport and Kelseyville, that's about the same figure, 8,000. So we had the number of people that were in Kelseyville and Lakeport, that was the population of all of Lake County. So as far as people, that was just a much, much smaller. Smaller county. The facilities were all smaller. The stores initially were just, it wasn't Safeway. They were just little markets. And there was a distinct difference, though, between summer, as there is not now, I don't think. We don't notice so much a difference between the summer season and the rest of the year. But back then, because there were so few people here, the influx of the tourists made a big difference, and it was just busier and more people around. And now, even though we still have tourists come in, there's so many regular people, that the residents, that you just don't notice the difference so much. And there were, I'd say, just early on, there were no stoplights in the county. I think the first stoplight that went into the county, you would think Lakeport, since Lakeport is the county seat, but actually the first stoplight that went into the county was in Lower Lake, right there at the junction of Highway 29 and 53, and that was due to the construction of the Homestake mine that was out east of Lower Lake, and that brought in so much traffic that they needed a stop sign. Yeah, but and I would say they had the adults had a lot of different kinds of clubs for activities. There was always like your service clubs, like the Lions Club or something, but they also had dancing clubs, and I think the winter population of the people during the non-summer months, got together with all kinds of different activities. Yeah.
Interesting. Did you have any goals or dreams for when you grew up?
I really didn't have, I think, any feature that I was really striving for, that's what I'm going to be. But I always liked reading, and I think I always thought I would want to do something in the literature or reading field. And actually, when I did go to college, I was focusing on being a teacher. And I took one education class, and I found it was the most dullest, boring class in the world.
Oh, really?
And I thought, I'm not going to spend my college years going, doing this, learning the principles of teaching and the this, and it just didn't interest me. So I switched over to a literature major and loved every minute of it. So, and then when I did graduate, I got on with publishing companies, and so it was.
So
well,
what college did you go to?
I went to, it was College of the Pacific at that time. It's now the University of Pacific in Stockton.
Oh, okay.
And it was a good mix for me because coming from such a small school, when there's 25 students in your class, even though I was a good student, if I went to UC Berkeley, I think I would have been lost. And College of the Pacific was a smaller campus. I think they had around just a total of a little over 1,100 or 1,200 students, and it was a very communal, where the the president of the college would have over the course of the first semester would have Sunday get-togethers. I don't know if it was actually for dinner or not, where little by little he would have every Sunday a group of the new incoming freshmen over for dinner. So it was just a very warm kind of college to attend. And it was good. And it was a typical beautiful college campus, brick buildings and the lawns and the whole 9 yards of it. It was, yeah.
And what was your first job after college?
My first job, I worked with Miller Freeman publication, and it was it was in San Francisco on 500 Howard Street, and it was a small, what they did is they did work journals or something that were like Mining World or Pacific Fishermen, and they were for industries type of a thing. And I didn't realize while I had the job that it was the most perfect job in the world, how well the employees were treated, the way I just took it for granted. I thought, well, this is just the way companies are, and it was very nice. And it wasn't until I got jobs afterwards that made me appreciate how well the Freeman brothers ran their company, because it was just a very warm, loving place, and I always thought I wanted to go back and say, you guys were really nice. And then I worked with McGraw-Hill, and that, of course, was much bigger and more technical and not a family feeling kind of a thing. But it was a good job, yeah. And then after a while, I was married, and my family was thinking of either selling the resort or if we wanted to come up and run it, operate it, or help them operate it, because they were ready to retire. And so we came back and worked at the resort.
Okay, so talk a little bit about the Seigler Springs Resort.
Well, the Seigler Springs Resort, it started out just people sort of homesteading the area, and then initially there was the use of the area by American Indians, and I think the general consensus is that they did not create a permanent residence there, but they traveled through. They traveled like from Borax Lake and Clear Lake, where they were a presence, and would go through that Seigler area onto the Russian River and the coast for just a change of, I think, seasons. They would move back and forth. But they would stay at Seigler's for a while because they used the hot waters and the baths. They developed, there was right above a creek that ran down to the outdoor pool, and there was a sulfur spring that was adjacent to that. And there was a big rock formation, a white rock, that they actually carved out a communal pool there that it's still, well, I don't know if it's still there, but it was still there when we left. And but there was no permanent residence there, and we would find, arrowheads and that type of thing. And another place I always was, when we were young, was good for arrowheads was on Perini Road in all the walnut orchards. They were always, for some reason, maybe because of the turning up of the dirt in an orchard, but I don't know how. It's all vineyards now, but that was always a good place.
What year did your parents buy the resort?
They bought the resort in 1934. So the first owner of that property was Frank Seigler. And he lived there for, there's quite a few years. And there were numerous owners until that my parents bought it. Some of the notable ones was Terrell Grigsby, and he's of the Grigsby Riffle fame. And the Grigsby Riffle is at the confluence of Seigler Creek and Cache Creek, and it measures the level of the water in the lake. The Grigsby Riffle is just and so he had the property for a while, and then a Dr. T.J. Boone, going back to Seigler, they presumed when he was there, it was 49 and 50, which was the era of the gold rush. And the presumption is that he was looking up Seigler Creek for gold, but instead the gold he found were the mineral springs and the mineral waters, but I don't know, real gold. And it was later, more like, I think, in the 1850s, that a Dr. T.J. Boone bought the place, and he was the first one to build a hotel and see it as an area where he could have people come and develop the springs. And so he developed mineral baths, and they had a dining room, and I think it was probably very small scale, but any subsequent owner still continued to use it as a resort and added on more amenities, from a pool to a dance hall to a better dining room. And early on, what was built was from a white native stone, and I want to say limestone, but I have no idea what kind of stone it was. Built the dining room, and that dining room still stands today. And the stone pieces that they used were big, like maybe 2 feet by maybe a foot depth and a foot in height, and so it was a very sturdy building. And that, I think they've done re-roofing, because I know when we left it, the roof was leaking. We had half of our cooking pots were up catching the drips when it rained. But and then one of the prominent and really notable people that purchased it was a J. Spalding, and that was of the Spalding Sporting Goods firm. And he and his father-in-law had purchased the property and developed what they added to the mix was a horse racing track on property that was below the resort, and it was in Seigler Valley. And the remarkable structure there was they built, I guess, a really state-of-the-art 3-story barn with a ramp that went up in it, that the horses could walk all the way up the ramp to the third floor. And so it was. Then we subsequently bought it, and there's a parallel story to this. The other end of the story is, in addition to Seigler's Resort at that time, which was like I said, with every owner getting bigger and better and more improvements and more things available. And their big emphasis was the mineral waters were incredible there. And they had numerous kinds they had magnesia, lithia, soda, even arsenic, and sulfur and iron. Some of the waters were hot and some cold. And and every subsequent owner just kept adding things. And then at that same time, I think it would be about the time that Spalding was building at Seigler's, there was the Hoburgs Resort. And the Hoburgs family came up in the late 19th century, and it was Gustav and Matilda Hoburg, and they came from Germany. And they set up a farm. That's what but just with their farm and their ranch house, they often just took in travelers who were going by, and where else would they stay? And they would take them in and for a meal. And then they had a son, Max Hoburg, and I think there were several sons, Max and Oscar. I'm not really quite sure of all their names, but it was Max Hoburg that when Gustav and Gustav died, then Max Hoburg took it over. And then he married Teresa Blues, and Teresa Blues was from San Francisco, and he had 3 sons. and they were George, Paul, and Frank. And this gets it into the 1920s. And at that time, the Hoburg's Resort was really the premier resort. They had all the amenities they had developed over the years. It was a premier resort in Northern California. And they had everything from a swimming pool to a baseball field to a croquet court. They had an enormous dining room, and they had accommodations around 200, that they could accommodate 400 people at that resort. They had a band, and not just a trio that was like what we had at Seigler's, a live trio music. They had a regular band that played every night in the outdoor ballroom, and they had an indoor ballroom. They had 2 bars. I mean, it was just everything you could want. But one thing they did not have was mineral waters or mineral baths. And so when Seigler's came up for sale in 1834, they wanted the mineral options to be able to offer their customers the opportunity to go for a mineral bath or a mineral waters or swim in the warm water pool. And so they were really interested in buying Seigler's, but they needed the capital and they needed a manager. And so when you need help, for many families, where do you look? You look towards your family. And their family they looked towards was my family. And my mother would have been the first cousins of Max's sons, the George, Frank, and Paul.
Oh, okay.
And so they were first cousins. And my mother was married then to my father at that time, and they were living in San Francisco on Dolores Street. They had their first child. You'd think they were just, sitting in the catbird seat. Why would they move up to a rustic resort and take on, all this work? But they just jumped at the chance, and so they had provided capital. And then my grandfather, my father's father, Captain Goodman Midnight Olson, also supplied the capital. So, but my father then was the manager. And so that was in 1934 they moved up there. And the resort at that time was fairly rustic. They had 50 rooms. They had a bathhouse that I can remember, and I thought it was spooky. It was dark and dank, and it was kind of scary going in that bathhouse for a little kid. And they didn't have a masseuse solarium, or it was pretty primitive. And so when my family bought it, in conjunction with the Hoburgs, they immediately started a major building plan and removed a lot of the older rustic cottages. And I think there was about 50 cabins at the resort when they, along with the hotel, when they bought it. And a good many of the cabins that were there, they removed little by little and replaced them with newer cottages until we ended up with, I think, about 100 rooms, both cottages and in the hotel. And we could accommodate, we would have like 100, so we could accommodate 200 or 200 plus people, just depending. And so and then little by little, we had just did a new bathhouse to replace the old bathhouse. And it was a state-of-the-art bathhouse. It was beautiful. It was stucco, and it had floor-to-ceiling windows on either end. And in that room, you'd go into a lobby area, and that's where the baths were, the individual baths, and they were Roman baths that you would step down into. And there were 6 Roman sulfur on one side and 6 on the iron baths on the other. And I don't know if you could tell the difference between if you were soaking in iron or soaking in sulfur, but they did have, they could control the temperature of each bath by the amount of spring water they would add into the mix. Because the temperatures there was also a steam room that they developed, which was an all-tile steam room with a rather small step-in pool. But most people didn't sit down in the pool, and I think the temperature of the pool itself was 126 degrees, which is quite warm. And then we had always instructions to not stay very long, or if you go into the water, only stay in the water to 5 or 6 minutes, or you could sit out on tile benches that went around the water and just steam. And it was hot, and you just walk in the room, and it was steamy and hot and damp, and was not my favorite room. And then in that same building, they had a very large indoor warm pool, and it was mineral waters that was mixed with creek waters to just have a nice, comfortable temperature for swimming. And that was all tiled. And then beyond that, we had built a very lovely solarium for a masseuse and a masseur. For a while, we only had a masseuse, and then we added a masseur as well. Or I got it right, we had a masseur, and then we added a masseuse for the woman.
Oh, okay.
And the solarium was really very nice because they had the massage areas downstairs, but the roof of the building was flat and it was fenced around. They picket fenced it around and then had a divider between the two. So if you wished, you could have your massage in the sun because it was very private and you were up above, and so you could have it either an indoor massage or an outdoor massage. And then beyond that, we had a very large outdoor swimming pool and children's pool that was a cut random tile. It was beautiful, all just intricately placed together to tile both the sides and the bottom of the pool. And we had a stone cellar, which was built with local stone, and then stucco on the second floor, and that was the bar, and there's a small dance floor there. And then upstairs there was a large store and just soda shop kind of area where you could get amenities to purchase some things if you needed a swimming suit or whatever. And then it was a soda fountain where they had hamburgers and things. And there was, at that time, slot machines in there. And there were a pool table and ping pong tables and all that. And we had tennis courts. And so, and people would come up, mainly, I think usually the typical vacation was like a 2-week vacation, and sometimes they'd stay longer. The family would stay longer, but perhaps the father would go back to work, where the family would stay another week beyond that, where he had to go back to work. And I would say the majority of our clients came from the Bay Area. And some clients came the same week, would say, same time every year, first 2 weeks of July, would stay in the same cabin or whatever. And so as over the years, people that came got to know other people that came. And so it was a community in that sense as well. The dining room, we served 3 meals a day. We had a staff of about 50 people, and that included everything from the chef down to the pot washer to we had a maids, we had, of course, waitresses, bartenders, the soda fountain people. So,
who worked there?
Well, we'd get applications really from all over, and again, I think mostly from Bay Area people, or maybe some came from Santa Rosa, but in my mind, they were mostly Bay Area people. But really, the backbone of our community, as far as employers, were local people. They were people that lived in the community, and they were the Deaners and the Perinis and the Kugelmans and the Wipers and the Hanschets and the Copsies. And some of them, like Al Kugelman, I think he was my father's right hand man as far as when it came to anything technical with structure, with building or repairing equipment or appliances. Ruth Ann Diener was one of our top waitresses, but she was also, as my kids considered, the top babysitter. So those people were, and we could depend upon them. We knew them. They knew us. Sometimes you get an employee, particularly for a summer resort, where you're asking somebody to work for 3, 4, maybe 5 months, and after the first paycheck, they get drunk. I mean, that's just, we didn't have to worry about our local people. And the other thing that was interesting, a good many of our waitresses were high school students.
Oh.
And often would get the same waitresses would come up every year for their years in high school. And a lot of the boys would come up to be dishwasher or maintenance guys, mow the lawn, work in the coffee shop. Mm-hmm. And another source for employees was the Yountville home. It's for retired military people. And, you know, they were fine. It wasn't, well, I guess there were some people there on the Yountville property that were in a hospital or needed care. But they were just people that, you know, men that had been in the service and were just living out their time. And they'd love to come up to Seigler's and work for a summer, because the problem is when you're dealing, the one thing too, when you're dealing with people, professional people, maybe waitresses and maids are easier to come by. But if you're dealing with a cook, a chef, or a bartender, you need somebody with some background and some skills. And they would be more difficult to find. So sometimes you would have, say like with the chef, for many years we had a chef who in the wintertime worked down at the Palm Springs Hotel, and then he'd rotate up to Seigler's for the summer months, and that always worked well. Chefs are temperamental, and they should be, because their job is very demanding, and you have to be on point all the time. And and if you're getting a chef, you want to get somebody who's reliable. But if you're getting somebody who's only working 5 months out of the year, you're not hiring somebody for a full-time job. So there's always a little question of how responsible they're going to be. So we had those kinds of issues where we would be counting on someone, and all of a sudden the guy was gone.
Right.
You know, or they get the first paycheck and they were out of there. But for our local, and if we needed something extra, if you wanted somebody to go the extra mile, do some extra work, or stay over for something, we asked the locals, or we asked family. We had a lot of my cousins that lived in the Bay Area. A lot of them would come up for the summer. And it was the ones that you went for. If you wanted somebody to go the full 9 yards, you knew they'd do it for you. And it was, my parents were very good employers. They were strict. They had their regulations, but their employees were their friends. And one of the things that I think was so very nice is that they allowed their employees to use the resort the way the guests did.
Oh.
They could use the swimming pool. They went to the dances in the evening. They could go into a coffee shop. And like I mentioned, some employee, like we had a maid who had a son that she could just stay, you know, he stayed with her and stayed because she had no place to put him. And we had several of those that would be an adult parent with a child. And then the child had just the run of the resort. He could go down to the pool or play ping pong or whatever he wanted to do. So I think it was a sort of a system that was very warm, and it worked for everybody.
How much did it cost to stay there?
Well, I wish I had the really definite figures, and I did look through my materials to see if I could. I lost all my archival material in the Valley Fire, and so I've had to sort of regroup and and so some things I just don't have access to. But it was, I would say, like in the 40s, we would have price ranges, like if you had a room in the hotel, and the hotel rooms were very simple. We did add newer rooms that were more elegant in the front of the hotel, but the ones at the back of the hotel, they were just a room. You had a sink in the room, but the bathroom facilities were at the end of the hall, where all our other rooms that had, their own private bathroom.
Was there an airport nearby?
That was the interesting thing. Hoburg's resort, both Frank and George Hoburg, had their own private planes, and they liked. When they wanted to go somewhere rather than using a car, they would be, more apt to take a plane, their plane, and they'd just bop all over. And if they wanted to go to Santa Rosa, they'd fly down there rather than drive. And then there would be bigger planes that they would have come in and would bring us guests. Some of the guests would come by plane. And we even would have, what was it? It was a it must have been a TV program, Star of the Day or Princess of the Day or something. They would win a free vacation at Hoburg's or Seigler's.
Oh.
And that individual would come up by plane. Yeah.
So who did your parents sell the resort to?
They sold it. One other thing I was going to say about the resort, as far as the conjunction of the resort with Hoburg's using Seigler's facilities, the reason that they were so interested, as I mentioned, that they wanted to be able to offer their guests the hot springs, the use of hot springs and mineral waters and hot baths, which they could not at Hoburg's. And so we had one of those little old woody station wagons that would go between Seigler's and Hoburg's. And the Seigler's guests could go over to Hoburg's for the day, and the Hoburg's guests could come to Seigler's for the day and could have the lunch meal at either resort and enjoy the facilities. And it did give the Hoburg's guests the opportunity to swim in an outdoor pool and take the baths and the mineral waters, and then our guests were happy to go up there to Hoburg's. Their slogan was "Among the Pines," and it was a very wooded resort area, and have lunch there and enjoy their facilities. So it worked out well for both parties, and and the resorts flourished. We started in the 30s, and it kept our building program where we were developing up, and within 10 years we had a first class, at Seigler's we had a first class resort. And then it was during World War II, and during World War II you had gas rationing, and you had tire rationing, and you also had what are the meal tickets? What do they call those? Rations. You had the ration tickets for buying meat or and we would collect ration tickets from their guests so we could buy meat for them, kind of a thing. And the resorts, because of that, and our main core of guests would come from the Bay Area. We would get them from the Valley, from Sacramento, and some, and maybe from up north. But for the most part, they were Bay Area people that were our guests. And because we were close enough to the city that they didn't have to use a lot of gas or worry about tires, kind of a thing. And that's also was conducive for them to stay for 2 weeks. They didn't want to be traveling around. And so that was all was helpful to us as far as the quantity of guests we would have. But then as we got out into the war ended, and it was into the late 40s and early 50s, and just people wanted to move around then, and campers became popular. Motels were sprouting up all over in vacation areas, and at that time our cabins were very nice, but they were beginning then all of a sudden, compared to the new motels that were coming up with their wall-to-wall carpeting and their marble bathrooms, our cottages were beginning to look a little rustic. And then you had air flight was cheaper, and that was people were flying to Hawaii, and they were actually traveling. Maybe they'd go to Yellowstone for 3 days, and they would go into Utah to Provo and be traveling around. And the whole idea of going to one spot and stay for your whole vacation time for 2 to 3 weeks just became passé. It was not, and so our business was going down, and we tried all kinds of different things, but it was a different era we were moving into, and there was at some point. Our resort, in comparison to new buildings and new resorts that were coming up, was country rustic, and that wasn't what they wanted anymore. So my husband came up with the idea that we were never going to be a first-class resort again, but we could be a first-class sports camp. And so what we did, he never was one he always started up at the top. So we contacted UC Berkeley and contacted their coaches and had their coaches come up and put on the Golden Bear Sports Camp. And we had, the football coach was Rennie Herrerius, who was a very popular football coach there. Then Pete Catino was water polo, and what was his name? Harris. Can't remember. We had also a wrestling coach. And so that sporting camp was geared like to 10, 12, 13, 14 years old, and they just would go from activity to activity. And it was fun. It was such a difference from having guests that you have to please to just providing the facility and letting the coaches do all the work about managing the activities. And then we added on a football camp, which was for high school football players to come up to do a camp just before football season. It came to the point then, though, that my parents and we were ready to move on as well. So we sold it in 1971, and we sold it to the Integral Yoga Institute of San Francisco, which was a thriving organization then, and yoga was very popular. And they held it for just a few years. What they thought that they could run this resort for people who wanted to come up for a retreat on a basis of volunteered labor. They thought people would come up and then they could volunteer to do the work around the resort. And they had no idea of what a big resort, how much work it maintains. And it just, the idea was good, but it just wasn't thought out enough to understand, and it just didn't work out for them. So they in turn sold it to, at that time they were called the Dawn Horse Communion, and it's now called the Mountain of Attention. It's the same people, but they just changed their names. And it's a mountain retreat, and still functioning today. And just looking over my information for this talk, I realized that this year it's going to be 50 years since they bought that property.
Oh, wow.
And I always thought we owned it longer than anybody, and we owned it for 37 years. And I thought, oh, wow, they've had it for 50 years. And they have retreats and do very well. And they also have maintained the property so nicely. The architecture of many of our buildings was white stucco with red tile roofs, and they've added buildings on with that same architecture. So they're doing very well. And
so, did you go through the Valley Fire in Cobb?
yes.
And did it burn your house?
Yes, I lost my house. I had gone for the day down to Berkeley Rep Theater, and so I was in Berkeley, and I met friends in Mill Valley, and we went over to Berkeley to the theater. And of course, I had my phone off during that whole time. And when I drove with my friends over to Mill Valley and to Berkeley, and then when we got back to Mill Valley where I had met them, I got back in my car and turned on my phone, and immediately my phone was ringing. My son had been trying to reach me, I guess, every 15 minutes for, 5 hours, and
wow.
told me that, there was a fire. But he assured me that they didn't feel, he had a cousin up there that looked, and he lives in Roseville, so it said that it didn't look like it was going to get to where we lived on our house, and it was on Hoburg Drive. And so I just was driving home. I just went home, and I was sort of robotic, actually. And going over Mount St. Helena, I saw all these cars coming the other way, and I thought, oh, I think maybe I'm going the wrong way. But I just kept on going, and I thought, well, I have friends in Middletown. I thought I could stay with them. And I get into Middletown, and everybody was leaving, and I just went to Perry's Deli and got a sandwich and just turned around and went back. You could see the flames right down there on the hill, and they were just evacuating everybody. So then I went back to Santa Rosa, and I have family in Santa Rosa, and stayed with them. So, yeah, it was.
Did you decide to rebuild?
Yes, no, I had thoughts of rebuilding. By that time, my children were both gone, and my husband had died. And I thought of rebuilding on the property, and I had talked with a modular homes was what I was sort of looking at. I was really reluctant to build because I thought, I'm not young, and do I want to spend 2 or 3 years or whatever I have left of my life building a house and making all these decisions? And I could tell you if it's done, if I liked what they did, but I didn't know if I could tell them what I wanted to do before they started. So I was looking at modular homes, and then the fellow who runs the modular home place came to look at my property, and he told me, and if the owner of the business is telling you, that my property was not a good spot for a modular home because they would have to put in too much infrastructure. It would be too costly. And so then I looked in the area and found a lovely home that was just a few miles from where I formerly lived. So it worked.
So you're affiliated with the Red Bud Audubon Society, and you participate in the Christmas bird count.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that and what the Red Bud Audubon Society is.
Well, the Red Bud Audubon Society is the typical Audubon Society that they have in many communities. There's the Peregrine Audubon Society in Ukiah, and there's the Napa Audubon Society in Napa. And what you do, you're interested in nature, primarily birds, and they have the Christmas bird count element of it is years ago, right at the turn of the century, in the year 1900, at that time what they did at Christmas, it was for all the hunters, they would have a party, an outgoing thing where they would try to kill as many birds as they can. And it was a contest to see who could get the biggest pile of dead birds. So this early bird lover decided, why not count the birds instead of kill the birds, and see how many birds you can count and how many different species, and then as well as how many total number of birds. And that was just a wonderful idea, and it took a while for it to catch on, but now it is something that every state and any sizable community usually has an Audubon Society, and it has moved not only in the United States, but it's moving around the world now. And they do have, at Christmas, from December 15th to, I think, January 7th, you pick your date for the Christmas bird count, and then you break up in teams, and you're assigned an area, or you select an area, so you're not birding in the same area somebody else is, so you're not counting the same birds twice, type of a thing. And we have 8 different areas, in addition to that. People will take an area and they will do with their small group will bird that area. In addition, at Anderson Marsh and at Clear Lake State Park, they have teams that lead a trip, and anybody who wants to join can go to one of those 2 places and participate. And you don't even have to know much about birds. Just come, because the more eyes you can see the bird, and maybe you can't identify it, but the more eyes that are looking, the more birds will we find, and we can help you identify it. And a lot of people do that, and all of a sudden they become addicted to birding as well as the rest of us. It's a passion. It's just one of those things that you get into. And it's always interesting to see the difference of birds that you have. We have some teams that will go out onto the lake itself. And if we do have teams that do that, we get many more birds than trying to bird from shore. And then you like to try to find very unusual birds. And this year, our team was very lucky in finding a Townsend solitaire that hasn't been seen. I don't know if it's ever been seen on a Christmas bird count before, but I know I went back 10 years and it hasn't been seen on the previous 10 years of the count. And it is seen occasionally, rarely in the county. And so we were delighted to find that bird. We went before you go, you have your area, and you usually go out a couple of times before your count day just to check and see what's there and we saw it on 2 of our pre-count day trips, and so we thought we just really wanted that guy to be sitting there on counting day, because he was on, a bare tree sitting there just right out in front, and just sat both times. And so when we drove up on count day, he was there sitting in his tree. So we felt very pleased that we got that extra special bird on our Christmas bird count. But Red Bud Audubon is just very good, much like the Land Trust, in preserving our natural property and people, and serving people that are interested, offering them places where they can hike and enjoy the nature. And another one is Boggs Forest, Boggs Mountain State Demonstration Forest, and it suffered dearly in the Valley Fire, and we're watching it now regrow. They did a lot of replanting, and some areas there's so many trees growing they're going to have to go in and thin them out. I mean, it just, but they're small. We had a forest, and there's some of the forest standing, but for the most part it got taken out, and the shrubs are growing back and things are growing back, but it's going to be years before it's the forest that it was. But all those organizations we're really lucky to have them in Lake County because they do serve. The Land Trust recently bought Milo property on the lake and the Rights Preserve, and it's just adding habitat for animals and birds and nature, and it's to get that into so they just don't build another motel there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So
how did you get interested in birds?
I think because living in Lake County, I think living in the country, city kids don't see it so much. But I guess I just had an innate interest in nature because I was interested in the plants and in the mushrooms and in the birds and seen any kind of animals, but I never did much with it other than enjoyed it, but never applied to study it. And then it was when my children were little, and I would take nature walks with them. And then I was the leader. I was the trip leader, and so I would have to identify things, and then they would have to remember them. This is a poppy, or this is that, or this is an acorn woodpecker. And next time you see the acorn, now what is that? And somehow it was the bird end of all the nature walks we took that appealed to me. And what really highlighted it and made me think, oh my, is there was a really colorful bird in the little house that we were staying out on the lawn. And I just saw it there. I'd never seen one before. And it was then called rufous-sided towhee. I loved the name because it was so bird nerdy, They subsequently changed the name to spotted towhee, and I liked the rufous-sided better. But anyway, it's a beautiful bird with rufous sides, which is like the color of a robin redbreast, and a white belly, and white spots on its black back and big eyes. And I looked at it, and I think if that made me get a bird book, or if I already had one, I got Robertson's Field Guide to Birds, the premier bird Bible, and looked in that and found what it was. And it just made me, and what really hit me was that bird, I've lived in this place all my life. I have never seen that bird because I never looked. And when I looked at that bird and saw it, well, then of course I could find them all over. And that made me just realize, if you don't look at it, you don't see it. And if people are like that, say with architecture, there's some people that they can just look at a building and they see the parapet and they just can take it all apart and know all the parts, and others of us can say, oh, it's a red brick building, and duh. Mm-hmm. So, but birding just real, and it's a fascinating hobby. I encourage it to all of you.
What's your favorite bird and why?
Well, I actually have several favorite birds, and one of them is the California quail. And that's also our state bird. And he is, you all know the California quail. You should know if you don't know. They're charming little birds, and they have these cute little crests. They're lovely patterned, and they have nice big flocks of little quail that are just charming, and you see them running around. And they have a lovely call that if you don't even need to see the bird, even know it's there, but you hear that call, which they give it the name of Chicago. He goes, Chicago, Chicago, and you know it's a California quail. Another one of my favorites is the common raven. And the common raven you don't see around the lake so much. It likes the mountains, but it's the big brother of the common crow. But the common raven is just an audacious bird. They love to fly and tumble in the air, and they're very vocal, and you can go out and you can't see a bird anywhere but the ravens. In the storm we've had, all the other birds are hunkered down and you don't see many, but the cravens are out there flying in it, enjoying every minute. And a friend of mine was telling me last night that he's seen the ravens, and they enjoy when there's snow, is rolling down the bank in the snow. So they are an incredible bird. Again, back to the Christmas bird count, it's done all over, and there is a fellow that's up in the Bering Strait that every year he does his Christmas bird count, and he only sees one species of bird. So the challenge for him is how many of this species he's going to see, and what species is it? The common raven. So they're just hardy birds. You'll find them everywhere. Another little vignette, it's a Scottish belief that if you see one raven, it's bad luck. So if you see one raven, you call out, "Raven, seek thy brother," and then you'll have good luck if the brother comes in. So anyway.
Have you ever traveled outside the United States? And if so, where did you go?
I have traveled many countries outside of the United States. Part of it, a good many of it, for birding, on birding tours. But my husband is also, he was the dean of Yuba College, and when he retired, then he took on lecturing on cruise ships. And there are those cruise ships, they're the party line cruise ships that they're not interested in it. But there are cruise ships that go out there, and they're really destination cruise ships that study your destination. So for at the Days at Sea, they want to entertain their guests, and they do that with giving lectures on the place where you're going. And so he would do that, and we were one of the first ships, I think, if not the first ship, that went into China after it opened up to the world again after it had closed down for so long. And I've been all over Asia and the Orient and Russia and Alaska and South America. It was a wonderful opportunity. And we were on the cruise lines, we were treated as guests. We had a stateroom, and we ate with the other passengers, and it was a wonderful way to travel.
And what kinds of hobbies do you have right now?
Well, I enjoy birding, and I enjoy any kind of anything with nature. Right now, I'm intrigued by the mushrooms that have emerged with this rain, and I've been, I've studied mushrooms, and I've got mushrooms books, but it falls out of my head because bird stuff gets in there and the mushroom stuff falls out. So I've just noticed a couple of really big, lush productions of just mushrooms so anything like that will, and if I see a plant or a tree, I want to name it. It's kind of a disease, because I sort of feel if you can name it, you own it. And so if I go on a walk, when I come home, I've got all this work that I have to do to try to figure out what I saw or whatever. And I love reading. Reading's always been a passion of mine. And
what was the best day of your life?
I would have to say, in truth, that the best day of my life was the day I married my husband. It set the course for me. He was an angel and always was. So it was, yeah.
What was your husband's name?
Bill.
And how did you meet him?
I met him at college. I met him at College of Pacific, and I was at that time, I had seen him around campus. I knew who he was, and he had come in the middle at the beginning of the semester, and he had been serving in the Korean War, and he had just been released, and he was interested in enrolling in the semester on the GI Bill, and so he was searching down for his favorite professor that he had before when he got his BA degree. So he just poked his nose in the classroom, and he saw that the teacher was giving a class, and he just immediately left. And well, the professor saw who it was, and he sent one of the students down to chase them back. So what was interesting, it was a Far East history and politics class, and Bill had just come back for the Far East. So for the rest of the class, the time was devoted to him talking to us about the Far East. But so I had seen him like that, and he had been in classes, but I had never really went out with him or associated with him. But this was my last semester. I graduated mid-semester, and I was all ready to go out to the world and get my career. And my parents wanted me to stay on. They said they'd pay for me for another semester so I could work that summer, because they depended on me I worked in the office, and they didn't want me not to be there. So, and then they said then I would be ready to go out in the world and get my career. And so this, I wouldn't have taken this. This is just happenstance. It's just how serendipity life is. So I stayed on that extra semester. And in one of my classes in that semester, it was Far East History and Islam. It was History of Islam. And we had a visiting professor there. And so it was a, what do you call it? Anyway, it was a special course. And so I'm sitting there in the class, and it's starting, and so then Bill walks in, and he comes in late. And so he happens to sit down next to me, and I just shove over the syllabus to him. And he looked at it, and so that was fine. We had a nice class. And then on the way out, I'm walking home in the rain to my apartment, and he stops his car and asks if I'd like a ride. And the rest is all history. So that's how I met him. And with the curiosity of it is, if I didn't stay on for the next semester, my life would have been entirely different. Oh. And you wonder those turns in the road that you take or that you do not take. And there's always a parallel life that you could have been living, and would it have been better or worse? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you have any children?
I had 2 children, yeah, a daughter and a son, yeah.
And what do you think it's important for people to know about you that we haven't talked about?
That I'm stubborn. And, well, that actually I like to be congenial and like to be courteous and be aware of, and sometimes I find that I'm not so considerate. I get sort of busy with something and maybe can be a little brusque, but I don't mean it. Yeah, no, I've lived a good life. I came across a quote recently, and I wish I could exactly remember it. About I don't know. I can't, because it would be something about how lucky a life you have lived. Then you're thinking of that, when you die, that you've just. And I have. I've been. I was blessed with a warm childhood, with loving parents, and a good young adult life. Had fun. Had a big, large, extended family that I thoroughly enjoyed, and now I'm to the point where most of my family is gone, and I don't like that. But I'm very grateful for what I have had. I've been truly lucky to have succeeded in having a good life.
And what's the best advice you could give future generations?
I would say seek. Seek whatever your passion is, whatever it is, and to find 1 or 2. And let it please not be the computer, not be computer games or some kind of something. To find something out of that. Something, if it be music, or if it's theater, or if it's welding, or whatever you like to do, find a passion, or more than one passion, and go after it, and give your life to it. Enjoy it. And you'll be surprised at how many people you meet that you really thoroughly enjoy. And people sometimes tell me that they're lonely or they don't know what to do, and I always tell them, go to a place where you like to do what you like to do, and then you will meet people like yourselves. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the bar, but if that's what you like, do it. But, go to the library and go to a tennis tournament or meet other people. But whatever it is, it takes you to do it. Find yourself a passion.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Let me see if there's something that I should have really mentioned about the whole 9 yards that I haven't. I'll think of it later. No, I don't think so. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I just think this Lower Lake School Museum is a wonderful museum, and I just would like to see more people visit it. And it's so interesting to find the history of the county, the place where you live. Everything has a history, and you'd be just surprised when, going down Lakeshore Boulevard, and I look at, I don't even know what the building is now, but it used to be Jean's Post Office. Do you know where Jean's Post Office was? Oh yeah, well that's something for you to seek out. It was sort of a community get-together place, and it was just at the, I don't even know what's in there now. I think maybe a furniture store. But they did have like a soda fountain there, but it was a hangout place. And he had all kinds on the wall, all framed arrowheads, Indian carved arrowheads. And it was a post office, it was a community center. And every building in that town has a history of what it was. And it's nice.
Thank you for taking the time.
Well, I'm glad to be able to
us.
share some of my story with you. I appreciate that, Gabriele, and it's something that I felt I should share my story because it's something that other people don't know.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.